Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second bite-sized animal law series. Our first one is now available on YouTube for everybody to review or watch for the first time. And tonight is our third lecture of our second bite-sized animal law series. And this series is on animal law, social justice, and their interconnectedness. So tonight we're very, very lucky to have Dr. Elizabeth Ormerod and Sarah Dixon be joining us this evening on discussing two different topics. So Dr. Elizabeth Ormerod will be discussing the human-animal bond, some recent research and case studies from her work, from her practice. And Sarah will be discussing no pet policies and rental agreements and the case for legislation, Jasmines law, which is a law that will outlaw the no pet policies, the blanket no pet policies. So this series will run until December the 14th, every Monday at 7 p.m. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Ormerod. As a small animal house physician, Elizabeth was responsible for Glasgow University's Inner Cities Charity Veterinary Clinic, during which period she became attuned to the significance of companion animals in the lives of vulnerable people. With multidisciplinary collaboration, she developed veterinary outreach programs, delivering animal-assisted intervention, or AAI programs, to schools, nursing homes, hospitals, sheltered housing, and prisons. As a Churchill Fellow and in subsequent study trips, Elizabeth has traveled widely to meet colleagues overseas working on pets and housing issues. She has advocated for her clients when threatened with eviction if they do not relinquish their pets. Elizabeth is the chairman for the Society for Companion Animal Studies, or SCAS, and she is the vice president for membership of Ohio, sorry, and co-chair of the Ohio International Task Force on Animal Welfare in AAI. She is the co-founder and vice president of Canine Partners, which is the UK Assistance Dog Program. She is the trustee of Our Special Friends and an advisor to Fostering Compassion. Elizabeth is also a visiting lecturer on the bond to UK veterinary schools. Her work is recognized internationally, and she is the recipient of the inaugural International William F. McCulloch Award for Excellence in Human-Animal Interaction Practice and Education. So can you all help me to give Elizabeth a warm, silent welcome? And tonight for Elizabeth's presentation, we're going to do a quick Q&A, and then she's going to show you a presentation and some of her case studies. Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth Ormerod, for joining us this evening, and I'll get started asking you the questions. Okay, you were in the veterinary profession for some 40 years. When did you become aware of the potential for animals to play an important role in people's lives?
It was really on graduation when I was appointed to the Inner City Charity Clinic in Glasgow. And my clients were living in dire poverty, social deprivation, in areas of high crime, violence, drug addiction, alcoholism. But I came to realise if they had a bond with an animal, they could actually cope with living in those conditions better than other people. And they were also able to cope better with chronic ill health and disability. So I learned how important the human-animal bond is, especially for vulnerable people. And also the dire consequences if that bond is ruptured unnecessarily. So that was my baptism of fire. And the ill health in Glasgow is really bad. Glasgow has the worst health in Europe. And it's not all down to living conditions. It's called the Glasgow Effect. People have studied it and they don't know why the health of people in the inner city and in the Cinque States is so bad.
That's very sad. Thank you for sharing, Elizabeth. I can see from your CV that you have practiced extensive community outreach involving schools, nursing homes, prisons, and more. How did that happen?
Well, 9 years after my husband and I graduated, he's also a veterinary surgeon and he's a veterinary pathologist who also had experience of working in that clinic. We bought a companion animal practice in northwest of England in a town with recognised health and social problems. And we did it with the aim of seeing what we could do with our veterinary knowledge and knowledge of the human-animal bond to help people and animals in that town. We had 4 main aims when we started. The one that was going to be ticked off in 2 to 4 weeks was to get positive pet legislation in the local sheltered accommodation. Then I thought I'd have a struggle getting into the schools to teach animal welfare. I wanted to introduce suitable pets, resident and visiting pets, into the local health and social care facilities and daycare centres. And I wanted to reach out to fellow professionals to teach them about the human-animal bond and how that related to their work. So what happened? Well, the 3 other points that I thought might be quite difficult, they were accomplished with some ease, and the colleagues from all different health and social care professions wanted to work with me. We developed programs and projects. We did extensive community outreach in all the schools, kindergartens, senior schools, colleges, and then into the prison, and then that led me to do national work in the prisons and international work. All went really, really well, except for pets and housing. Pets and housing that I thought I'd tick off within 2 to 4 weeks, 28 years later, had not had much of an impact. So I had to take any of my clients who couldn't get accommodation, especially the older people. I took each case individually and had to fight for them, and usually had to fight really hard. And on average, it took a month to get permission for them to keep the pets, during which time they were so ill that I am really surprised that none of them died, because they weren't able to eat or sleep. They were pacing, they couldn't sit still, they were retching, they were in pain. It's absolutely horrendous. The worst situations that I ever saw in veterinary practice where people being forced to relinquish the pets just because a housing manager said, or a landlord said, "You're not bringing that pet here."
And interactions with the council, Elizabeth?
Well, my first stop was to go to the local council, to the housing committee. And I thought we'd be able to enter into a dialogue and I'd be able to explain the health and social benefits and they would be interested. Even at the first meeting, they wouldn't talk to me. They weren't interested. I offered to do them free workshops and seminars over the years. I kept offering. No, they weren't interested. Then we got a new leader, this time in the Labour Party, and he came back to me and said, yes, we will have a seminar about pets and older people in housing. We had a date arranged, 6 months in the future. And on that day, a call came in from the council to say, tell Mrs. Ormerod that meeting's cancelled and we're not going to reconvene it. Over the years, I travelled to the States, to California, to Arizona, to meet people that had been successful in introducing pets and housing policies there, that then led to the federal pets and housing bill. I went to Japan to learn what had happened in Kobe after the Great Hanshin earthquake, and the housing people there eventually introduced a positive policy. So I felt I had to travel to go and see why and how it had worked, but still my local authority didn't want to know. And they then started saying it wasn't a local issue, they weren't getting any guidance from Westminster, so I went to Westminster and I was told this is a local authority issue, it's nothing to do with us. And we then, through SCAS, we supported 3 pets and housing bills for older people, with Paul Burstow, with Nick Palmer, with Nigel Watterson. and they all got prorogued in the Lords. And you know, I thought this, I thought my community would be signed off in 2 to 4 weeks. I would then monitor what happened in our community, and within a year or two, we'd have the national law, as they got in America, within 2 years of California and Arizona passing state laws. So I think everybody can tell that I am really, really fed up, and I'm now wondering if this is ever going to happen within my lifetime. We need your help.
Yes. Oh, and I believe you have selected a few case studies. Could you say something about the case studies?
I thought it might be helpful for you to learn the kinds of situations and the effect that it has on people, and just how unjust this is. It's the most vulnerable people in society that this is happening to. By and large, it's not happening to wealthy people. It does happen to some wealthy people who buy an apartment and think they can take the pet, and then they find out there's a covenant on that building, which means they cannot have the pet. But by and large, this is something that affects vulnerable people throughout the UK. So I'll just show you some slides of some of the people that have been affected by this. So I just want to say as well that I have witnessed severe bullying and harassment of older and disabled people in these circumstances. People being told, get rid of that animal or I will evict you, sometimes within 2 weeks. They say within 2 weeks, you will be evicted. We will remove your dog. We will come to your house and we will remove your dog. And to this elderly lady in her 80s with many health problems, with no family left apart from this cat, I was in her house when housing officials came and shouted in her face and finger stabbed her and went on saying, you obviously have short-term memory problems. I quite clearly told you we have a no pets policy. Get rid of that cat. That case actually worked out okay because they thought that I was the nasty niece who was wanting the lady out of the house that she had inherited. That lady had nursed family members for over 40 years. And she spent 12 years nursing her sister-in-law and her brother, who both were bedridden. And within 2 weeks of them dying, she was told to leave that house, go to sheltered accommodation. And the housing officials naturally assumed that I was the person who wanted this lady out of the house. So I let them go on for about 5 minutes and then told them not to speak to my client. The colour then drained from the faces, and I told them they had 48 hours in which to come up with a solution. By the next morning, they had rehomed her in a proper house, not a tiny flat where she had to share a bath with men, not a tiny flat where the WC was in a cupboard without a sink, not a tiny flat where there wasn't room for a chair as well as a single bed. I kid you not, she was in a flat that was smaller than many of the prison cells that I've been in. But by the next morning, they rehoused her to a house with a big living room, a bedroom, a proper kitchen, a proper bathroom, a front and back garden. She could keep her cat and at a lower rent. Next slide. So you might have heard of Bob and Darcy. Bob, 87 years old and renal failure, terribly bullied and harassed following the appointment of a new manager to his pet-friendly nursing home. The bullying was so horrendous, and I witnessed this. He had to leave the home with his beloved dog. His little dog was his last link with his wife, and he was not going to give up Darcy. I and my friends, we were actually reported to social services for bullying and harassing him. Absolutely unbelievable. This man had been on renal dialysis for 20 years and subjected to the most horrendous, really awful bullying. Next slide. And this is Roy and Princess. Roy and his wife were living in a flat. It was actually on the top flat of a big building. They both had respiratory problems and there was no lift. They were finding it too difficult to climb the stairs, and they were offered a flat in newly built sheltered housing, which had a no pets policy. They loved Princess dearly and could not part with her. And what we had to do in this case was find her B&B accommodation with another older client in a nearby street, which wasn't ideal. Next slide. This is Miss Holden, wonderful lady who heard about the plight of Princess and offered to provide bed and breakfast because they couldn't even take their dog into their new flat. So I registered Princess as a pack dog, and Princess and her mum and dad spent all the days in local nursing homes. And they did that for quite a long time, but eventually they found it too depressing because the people that they'd got to know were developing dementia, becoming very infirm and then dying. And they just couldn't bear to see that anymore. So they ended up breaking the tenancy agreement by taking Princess into the flat, and they were served with an eviction notice. Get rid of your dog or you will be evicted within 2 weeks. Anyway, that was a better news one because all of the residents in those flats got that letter. And I sat with them and I developed a pet owner committee policy, taking the responsibility of pet ownership from the manager to the owners themselves and to myself. And I went above the manager straight to the board, and the board of directors, the chairman, came on the phone as soon as she got my letter and said she had no idea that the manager had sent that letter, and of course they can keep their pets. And she said, we'll follow everything that you've written, even so they can have another pet if the pet dies, provided that you select it. Next slide. And you may have heard of this case as well. This is John Chadwick, who was tragically lost to suicide when he was forced to relinquish his pets to go to new accommodation. Within a few days of moving, he was dead. Maidstone Borough Council, which is where this happened, they have now introduced a pilot scheme for 12 months to see if they can help pet owners to find accommodation. So we'll see how that works. Next slide. So what I want to do now is give you just a brief overview of some of the documented benefits of pet ownership. Next slide. When I talk to students, I do this by ages. I think it's we get different emphasis on benefits for different ages. So in children, it's been documented that children reared with pets have better empathy and empathy and pro-social behaviours that last into adulthood. They tend to have higher self-esteem and be more confident. They tend to have more friends, improved learning skills, better immune function. This is really interesting. They have fewer allergies of any kind and fewer infections. And it seems to be that exposure to foreign protein in babies and young children helps to key the immune system so that we don't overreact to certain things, but we do react to others. And this is a really important finding. So you need to think about the damage that's been that's happening to people that aren't allowed to have a pet. This is damaging their development. And there's some recent research now looking at interacting with animals and how that helps people and adults and children cope with trauma. Again, this is really important. Next slide. There's not so much research about youth, but what has transpired is that youth that are bonded to dogs have more respect for the parents and more traditional values, better academic achievement again. They cope better following parental separation if they maintain contact with the dog. They get drawn less into gang culture, crime, or addiction. And this is, just have a think about this. What effect is happening in society by not letting people have pets, and especially not letting boys have dogs? I've put a wee note at the bottom about prison studies. There's a lot of, across the world now, a lot of prisons have introduced dogs, and we're finding this is having a major impact on prisoner behaviour while they're in the prison. And a few studies that have been done, especially in the States, are showing amazing effect on recidivism rates. So one of the prisons that I visited in Oregon, Project Pooch, which was initiated in 1993, none of the young men, and they're able to follow them up, but in the state of Oregon, none of them have been readmitted to prison in Oregon since 1993. Next slide. And those of you that work with offenders, you know that the rate of recidivism is high, especially with young offenders. And so now adults and companion animals. Next slide. So really interesting findings here. You should also be thinking about the cost savings to society. So typically, pet owners visit GP 15% fewer times, and that equates to an NHS saving of 2.5 billion annually. Of particular note are the effects of pets on the cardiovascular health. Pet owners have a lower risk of cardiovascular attack, that is heart attack or stroke, and better long-term survival rates. We think this is linked to the levels of neurotransmitters in pet owners, and particularly oxytocin, and also the lower cortisol levels. Oxytocin counteracts stress and promotes trust and pro-social behaviours. And on the next page, we'll look at some other associated benefits. Pet owners also benefit from social support. So studies show that they cope better with bereavement, divorce and illness if they're bonded to an animal compared to people that aren't bonded to animals. And pets mitigate against loneliness, which is now recognised as a major cause of illness. Next slide. So elevated cortisol levels are very damaging to health. So these top effects are damaging to the cardiovascular system, but the pet owners have that at a lower level. And oxytocin, when I was a vet student, we were only taught its effect, the perinatal effects in parturition and lactation. But more recently, it's been identified as a key hormone in protecting the cardiovascular system. Lowering of blood pressure, vasodilation, parasympathetic neuromodulation, has an antioxidant activity and an anti-inflammatory activity. And I read a paper that demonstrated that it can actually heal damaged heart muscle. So we're now seeing why it is that pet owners are less likely to have cardiovascular attacks and why they're more likely to survive long term. And some of these studies are showing that the incidence of heart attack and strokes in pet owners is 30% less. Next slide. Again, think about people that want a pet, they're not allowed a pet. We're putting their health at risk. And older people and companion animals, some very important benefits here too. Next slide, please. So those of you who work with older people, you know it's important for them to have structure to the day. And pets provide that, especially for people that are living on their own. It can get too difficult for lonely people to get up in the morning, to take care of themselves, to bother to cook, to keep the houses warm. But we find that the pet owners do all of these things. They get up in the morning to care for the pets. They feed the pets. They have the breakfast. They go to the shops to buy the pet food. They buy their own pet food. They talk to people. They have more visitors because people come to see the pets as well as them. They have improved and sustained activities for daily living scores. The pets mitigate, especially in this group, against loneliness and depression. They give people who are no longer in employment or caring for children, they give them an identity, purpose and meaning. They promote independence. Pet owners are less likely to need nursing home care. They're a buffer against relocation shock. Again, this is why they should be allowed to take them into sheltered housing. They promote exercise. Lack of exercise is a causal factor in most of the chronic illnesses of middle and old age. Dog owners especially take a lot more exercise than non-dog owners. And what we all have to realise is a pet is often the most significant other, and very often a living link, and sometimes the only living link to a deceased spouse. So this puts it in context of what happens when people are told to get rid of these animals. Next slide, please. I don't know if you're familiar with the term social capital effect, but research in Australia has demonstrated that companion animals, especially dogs and cats, are the most important factor in creating what we call social capital. Networking in communities, catalysts for neighbourly behaviour and exchanges, reciprocal favours, giving a sense of community. And the researcher found that pet ownership is positively correlated with these activities: civic engagement, volunteerism, participating in activities and campaigning for good causes. Next slide, please. If you just go back to that, you don't need to go back to the slide, but I just want to say that I see this even within an institution. So when I visit prisons that have animal presence, I can tell at the gate, because the attitude is very different. The attitude throughout the whole prison becomes one of cooperation and easier management and feeling less threatening. When the animals were introduced, even to category A prisoners, because I worked in the Shot Special Unit and visited Barlinnie Prison, with the animals present in these special units, the atmosphere is totally different. But this is what happens in a wider community as well. And I just want to say that the main concern of SCAS in the past, so when we started looking at this in 1979, our main concern was for older people forced to relinquish their pets when moving to supported living. But the situation now is affecting young individuals and families who are finding it very difficult to get suitable rental housing that permits pets. And the economic situation is making this much worse, and it must be addressed very urgently to prevent the negative consequences of forced relinquishment. And this is what happens when people are forced to give up the pets. So their physical and mental health declines. It will result in increased costs to the NHS, because that 2.5 billion, that's only through the 15% fewer GP visits. It's not taking into account the chronic ill health conditions that pets are mitigating against, and the loneliness and depression. There will be an adverse effect on child development and child health. There will be a negative impact on social capital. So you could end up with areas of cities where pets are not allowed, and the neighbourhoods will become less friendly and more threatening. They become more negative. Very large numbers of animals will be surrendered to animal shelters, but there will be fewer people, because of housing rules, fewer people able to adopt. So many healthy animals will be euthanized. So we very much welcome Andrew Rossendale's bill. I do have, I think my next slide's about housing. No, this one. The other thing that I want to say was the lack of pet-friendly accommodation is one of the drivers of homelessness. Some of the people that you see on the streets with the pets, they could not get accommodation. But then they're in a catch-22, because most of the homeless hostels in the UK refuse pets, and they won't leave the pets. And this is just absolutely dreadful. Dogs Trust will work with hostels to show them how to safely introduce pets, but most of them haven't done it. Remember, a gas collect case set up the Hope Project in the 1990s, and some decades on, we've not advanced very much with this, despite the work that's been done by Hope, which is now run by Dogs Trust. Can you show me the next slide, Tiffany? Right, so I don't know if you want to take over now, Sarah, and then if there's time we could go back to, I've got slides on housing.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks very, very much, Elizabeth. It's all very eye-opening. Lots to learn and lots of work to be done, I think. I'm just going to, bear with me. There we go. Okay, excellent. So we'll move on to Sarah's portion. And then, as Elizabeth said, we can come back to some slides as well as the Q&A, so you can ask questions. Okay, so Sarah Dixon. Sarah is a practicing solicitor and director of the FOAL Group and an animal welfare campaigner. Amongst other campaigns, the FOAL Group are currently supporting Andrew Rosendale MP's bill, known commonly as Jasmine's Law, which seeks to address no pet policies. So again, we'll do another silent welcome. Thank you, Sarah, for being here and for presenting with us. And I have some questions for you as well. So for your first question, what is the current legal position in the UK?
Okay, so the current position is there are several laws that we have to take into account. The two primary ones when it comes to tenancies are the Housing Act and the Consumer Rights Act, surprisingly enough, of 2015. The focus really tying into Jasmine's Law is actually Consumer Rights Act, because under that, both parties must agree on fair clauses. So anything that's unfair can be challenged in court. And the basic principle there states that a tenant is to be allowed to request permission to keep a pet. What we are finding is actually that landlords are removing that clause. So they're bringing in a new no pet clause by a back door. So they're removing that choice to request permission. Personally, I think that if challenged, that would be unenforceable because it would fail because it's not fair.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Is this really an issue?
Oh, yes, it is. I mean, if we've learnt nothing more since January of this year, what we will have seen is a dramatic increase, particularly in the homeless community, it has to be said, who the government suggested had to be provided with accommodation to protect them as a vulnerable group from the virus. What that's actually highlighted, actually, who's going to house them and under what condition? What we've seen is, and you've possibly come across street vets and dogs on the street, quite frequently taking the animals from the homeless and looking after them temporarily just so that they can accept the offer of accommodation that they've been handed. Liz already mentioned the case of John Chadwick, and that's a classic case where he was offered accommodation and he had no choice. It was animals or a roof over his head, and if he refused that offer, he would remain homeless and go to the bottom of the list again. He would be low priority. So since, like I say, since March, there has been a real highlighting of the issue of the lack of acceptance of pets You know, and like I say, ironically, the government at the same time said that, you know, that we were to protect the homeless, but we weren't to protect their pets. And as Liz has already highlighted, for some people, their pets is their only reason for being. The most recent figures I have, and like I say, again, because of lockdown, I'm assuming these things have not been conducted. But in Gloucester of this year, the results of their research suggest that only under 4% of landlords were accepting pets. 4%. 7% for houses and 2.7% in flats. I mean, so it most definitely is an issue.
Thank you, Sarah. What are the common concerns?
Okay, we hear several times landlords are concerned about damage to their property, properties being left with physical damage, pungent odours, nuisance to neighbours from noisy dogs or cats for that matter, infestations of fleas, you know, all the common kind of things. They also sometimes suggest they want to protect their property for future tenants who may have allergies. You know, there's also, and Liz again highlighted, that sometimes, particularly in blocks of flats, there may be a covenant in the head lease that prevents pets. You know, there's certainly, if you've got an old building, it was quite commonplace then to have those covenants in as standard covenants. And like I say, if you've got a 999-year lease that was drafted in 1800 and whatever, it would not be unusual to think that that's there and being carried forward. Some suggest that it's inappropriate for a pet to have in that particular property. What I would say though is that, particularly in relation to damage or fears of damage and nuisance, there are remedies available. There's also obligations on the pet keeper. You know, we have the Animal Welfare Act, so they must look after their pets appropriately. We have the Dangerous Animals Act, so if somebody should have a snake, then you know, a poisonous snake, there are regulations there. We have the Animals Act, which imposes on keeper the obligation that if your animal causes injury to property or a person, you are liable for that. So there are various mechanisms there to protect landlords and their property.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so you've just touched on a few, I guess. Are there any legal protections available?
There are. The landlord always has the chance or the opportunity to seek repossession if, and it is a big if, there is damage or nuisance caused, or someone is in breach of a term of the rental agreement. However, I'd suggest again that unless the damage or nuisance is of a significant degree, that the court would probably suggest that the landlord would not get possession of the property, but may insist on the tenant that they actually have to rehome the animal and make alternative arrangements. But the issue really comes then, what happens on renewal? Do you really want to go down that route and have that argument with a landlord if you've got a pet that is causing damage or being a nuisance? I would suggest the landlord is probably not even going to engage with you for a renewal, and you certainly wouldn't get a reference for a new lease. So again, it's coming back to responsibilities of the tenant too. So what we mustn't do is fall into the trap of thinking that all landlords are bad, because that's certainly not the case. But equally, not all animal keepers are responsible. So there has to be a meeting of the ways in the middle. So, you know, there are options available. One of the things that landlords also have to be aware of, and possibly are, is that if they do get possession of the property back through using court bailiffs, if the tenant leaves the animal in the home, in the property, that animal becomes the responsibility of the landlord. So that is a big problem, and something that we really need to look at, because if you are a keeper of an animal, then you shouldn't be abandoning it for a start. You should take responsibility for it. So, like I say, there are various genuine concerns for landlords, which shouldn't be just overlooked and dismissed. These are what we have to take into account whilst we're looking at the bill that Andrew's proposing. And I think it does, because what it's saying is that negotiations have to be done on reasonable grounds. You know, but blanket no pet policies aren't reasonable. They just aren't. Of course, there are properties where it would be most unsuitable for keeping certain types of animals. You know, putting, for example, 2 Great Danes on a 17th floor flat would be horrendous. I would actually go further and actually say that the keeper of the animal's not got the animal's welfare in mind anyway, to even suggest that would be appropriate. But I'd say, so we have to come back to the basic principle of being reasonable in expectations and demands on both sides.
Thank you, Sarah. And lastly, how would the introduction of Jasmine's law improve the current situation?
Because I think it comes back to the principle of being reasonable in negotiations. It sets everybody off on a clear footing. So if at the very outset you are saying what the landlord is willing to do, what the tenant is expected to do, and vice versa, I think that will give assurances to both sides of the equation. What we can't have is a position where one side has a much stronger bargaining position purely because someone has got an attachment to an animal. That's just, as Liz has already said, that attachment is very real, it's very physical, and the benefits of it are notable. You can't deny that. Ironically, one of the things that quite frequently suggested is that people with pets should pay a higher premium, they should put in insurance. There are pet insurance policies available. But only this morning, the government, earlier this year, updated their model assured short hold tenancy agreement. And I'm going to have to read this to you because I haven't memorized it, so bear with me. So it says, the tenant must not keep any pets or other animals at the property without prior written consent of the landlord, which must not be unreasonably withheld or delayed. So far, so good. Then it goes on to say, if permission is given, it may be given on the condition that the tenant pays an additional reasonable amount towards the deposit. So we hit a problem, because under the Tenant Fees Act 2019 in England, anyway, there is a maximum deposit that can be requested by a landlord of 5 weeks' rent. It's not the same in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, where they can impose a pet deposit. So sometimes what is happening instead is that landlords have tried increasing the rent to include a pet, which is actually a financial penalty. So that doesn't sit well either, but that just shows you the issue that we've got, because the government's own model assured short hold tenancy has a problem. It's in conflict with actually other statute, and so we have to address that too. I think that there's certainly further points to discuss, and these will come out as the bill progresses through Parliament. But on the whole, I think it's time that we actually did get this record straight on an even footing, so that everybody knows where they are. Properties are protected, but tenants also know that they don't have to face that dreadful decision that for some is just too much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you both very much. Elizabeth, if you want, we could pop back to your 2 slides. I think it's left there, and then move over to the questions. Is that
okay? Yeah.
Sure. Okay, bear with. All right. Okay.
So these are some examples of best practice in the UK. In the year 2000, Wandsworth Borough, they examined all of the tenancy policies, and they had previously enacted what was more or less a ban on pets in housing, because the conditions for having a pet were so restricted that only people with direct access to a garden could have one. But in 2000, they decided that that was unfair, and they enacted a positive policy across all the housing types, including high-rise and sheltered accommodation. And they are very pleased that they've done that. They say that they have fewer pet-related problems now that pets are actually permitted, because there are rules. So in the past, people weren't allowed pets, but they got them anyway, and there were lots of pet-related issues. Now that they have rules and they're allowed pets, things are working well. And they actually report that the communities are happier. They're seeing this social capital effect. Anchor and Hanover have now merged, and both of them have always had positive pet policies and report there are no pet-related issues that cannot be resolved. The same thing was said to me by Josephine Ross at Wandsworth Borough Council. A housing officer should be able to resolve any tenancy issue, including pets. Note that Anchor in 1998 conducted research throughout the UK, surveying veterinary practices and animal shelters, and they estimated that annually 140,000 pets owned by older people were being relinquished when they were moving into accommodation. And it's known that 38,000 of those animals were euthanized. We don't know what happened to the other 100,000. These are more animals than are admitted to local authority pounds. The scale of it is phenomenal. And Maidstone Borough, where John Chadwick had been lost to suicide, they have now introduced a pilot scheme to help owners to get pet-friendly accommodation. I've put a wee note at the bottom. Members of SCAS, under the leadership of Sir Roger Gale, developed pathway guidelines in the 1990s, which were updated about 15 years ago, and we're updating them again, and they'll be published soon. And this is to help landlords understand more about animals and what to do about any issues, how to prevent issues, what support is out there for landlords to resolve issues. Next slide, please, Tiffany. Things are improving overseas. We're kind of being left behind. So France, as long ago as 1970, passed a national law, and it's enshrined in their national legislation and viewed as a human right. As long as people can look after pets properly, they can have a pet, and that's extended to all housing and more recently to holiday lets. India has a nationwide positive pet policy in all housing. In 1983, in the USA, following successful legislation statewide in Arizona and California in 1981, they enacted the Federal Pets and Housing Law for sheltered accommodation, which has since been extended to cover more public housing. So they passed the law in Arizona and California, and my colleagues at UC Davis monitored the effects and the landlords' perceptions of this before it happened, and then how they felt about it a year later. And the landlords were very pleasantly surprised. They thought before the pets went in, there'd be absolute mayhem. The older people wouldn't be able to care for the pets, they'd be overrun with pets, there'd be loads of complaints, it was just going to be an absolute disaster. When they were interviewed a year later, they said it's working really well. Only a quarter of the older people have actually adopted a pet of their own, but many of the older people have chummed up with pet owners. They've become animal aunts and uncles. They're sharing the care, there's better community spirit, people are becoming good neighbours. And there were some complaints, but when the complaints were examined, it was found that people who had complained about the pets had also complained about visiting grandchildren. They'd complained about birds flying overhead. They'd complained about the neighbours' curtains, and they'd complained about the colours that neighbours had painted their doors. So the assumption is there are some people who go through life and their modus operandi is to complain about things. They like complaining. And they were complaining about the pets amongst many, many other things. In Kobe in Japan, a lot of the private housing, which hadn't been very well built, that was belonged to by older people, was damaged in the Great Hanshin earthquake. And they built new housing, lots of new housing. But the older people with pets would not go to the new housing. They were living on the streets. They lived rough with the pets through a Japanese winter rather than give up the pets. And the housing officials could not understand this. The housing is here. You know, these houses are vacant. These beautiful houses, come and live in them. But the older pet owners wouldn't, because they couldn't take the pets. And it ended up that the housing officials went to meet the older people. And that's where they learned about the importance of the relationship. Until they met the people with the pets, they did not understand that relationship. So I went to Kobe and I met the housing officials and they explained all this to me. And then they took me to meet the older people with the pets in the new housing. So it had a happy ending. But when that earthquake occurred, and this happens all over the world, very often pets are not admitted to the emergency shelters. So people escape a flood or an earthquake or whatever, and then very often they're living on the streets because they cannot access the emergency shelter with the pets. And there's been recent positive legislation in New Zealand. So the government introduced positive pets policies to all government accommodation. There's been positive pets legislation for rental housing in Australia and in Ontario in Canada. So I'm very, very much hoping that Andrew Rossendale's bill gets through with everybody's support. It's much more important an issue than many people realise. So anything that anybody listening can do to help, please do. I don't know if we've got another slide. No.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Thank you very, very much. It's really fascinating to see, you know, how old some of the legislation is in some of the other countries and places. Very interesting. Thank you both so much.